The line of men sank all at once in front of the issue window, as if an invisible rope had yanked it tight. The front rank stopped. The ranks behind kept pressing forward. Shoulders drove into ribs, sweat ran from necks into collars. Heat, carrying a grit of metal dust from the shops, clung to skin as if it meant to stay there. The corridor was narrow, hemmed in by wooden rails and wire fencing. There was no room to step aside, no space to bleed pressure away. The only direction the mass could go was forward, so force stacked on force until bodies moved as one. Someone slipped. A knee struck the wood with a dull crack. The man's torso twisted sideways under the crush, and the canteen coupon stub clenched in his hand took a hard crease under a boot sole. The paper's fibers gave a dry, brittle sound, an unexpected fissure, like something breaking where nothing was supposed to break. Behind the window, a wooden table was pinned by a rough palm. The quartermaster sergeant flattened the day's ledger sheet, his fingertips stopping on a clean, empty square. No number, no signature, nothing but blank space, as if someone had cut a hole in the page. That blank square didn't simply sit there. It erased the proof for every line that followed it. It unstitched the chain. By regulation, an issue chain that did not close could not continue issuing. No next stub could be allowed to cover the gap. If the record broke, the process stopped. The sergeant turned his hand, gathered the stubs already handed out, and clipped them back into the folder in order. He pressed the ledger's corner down under a clip and sealed the tabletop itself, locking the blank square in place as if locking it away could keep it from spreading. The sealing gesture became a sensation in the line. Men in back couldn't see the tabletop. They saw only that issuing had stopped. They heard only the small sound of paper being pinched under metal, and it sounded like their share being pinched away. Feet scuffed harder, breathing thickened. Shoulder impacts grew heavier, each bump carrying the weight of hunger. A prisoner, one of the weakest, was squeezed to the fence line. His spine flattened against the wire. Sweat ran from his brow ridge, tracking down his face. His fingers hooked into the wood rail until knuckles blanched. A hand reached to help him. The push from behind knocked that hand away. Help and pressure cancelled each other out in the same second. Military police tightened formation at the mouth of the corridor. Their boots struck the hard ground in short, even beats. They narrowed the corridor's sides further, forcing the line into 2 lanes. Anyone who tried to slip past the front rank would immediately collide with a shoulder and be pushed back into place. The frailest men were pulled off to the side and made to sit against the fence. Lips cracked, eyes stayed fixed on the issue window as if staring could keep their names from vanishing. The isolation protected them, and it also peeled them out of the line's sightline, as if their existence could be forgotten more easily when it wasn't in the center of the crush. Beyond the fence, the arsenal's roar went on. The drop of a power hammer sent vibration up through the ground. Each shove in the corridor carried an echo of machinery. It was mid-July 1944, and Rock Island Arsenal on the Mississippi River in Illinois ran around the clock. The tempo of lathes, welding, and storage did not pause for anyone's hunger. In the rear, industry took the war apart into countless parts that could be numbered and tracked, then sent those parts back into the front as replacements, repairs, and replenishment. Europe's consumption had pushed maintenance, assembly, and distribution toward the edge. People were resorted. New Italian service detachments and prisoner labor details were squeezed into the same tightened schedule. Roll call, work hours, issuance, signatures, everything was compressed into fixed minutes. Miss the window, and the only route back was review. Review depended on ledgers. Ledgers depended on signatures. Signatures depended on witnesses and an unbroken chain of handoffs. Marco Rinaldi stood at the registration table nearest to the ledger and felt as if a sheet of ice had been pressed to his back. He had done logistics in the Italian army. He knew each issue had to match a name, a time slot, and a signature. He knew one missing line was enough to swallow a man into dispute. That morning, he had been called out at roll call and assigned to the distribution point. His task was simple: transfer names from the roll to the ledger lines, confirm head count, file the stubs according to procedure. He controlled no stock and decided no one's place. But the job placed him in the most exposed position in the corridor, the witness to paper order. Men in line watched his hands as if measuring distance, how close he stood to American authority, how far he stood from them. He knew another kind of calculation better. In his own army, once, during warehouse confusion, he had shifted a small portion of rations aside to trade for a favor that would keep him alive. It had not been a snatch and run, it had still been a breach. That breach had taught him what grey gaps did. They swallowed the weak first. They swallowed everyone last. The shame of that act made him allergic to choosing sides in public. He had learned to hide behind silence, to counter fear with small schemes, to wait for storms to pass and slip out afterward intact. Now the storm was on paper. That blank square was not one less mouthful of food, yet it was enough to halt issuance for the day and let hunger pile in the corridor into physical weight. Someone moved through the mass during the stoppage, gesturing sharply. The blank square was tied to theft. The ceiling was called a cover-up. The MP tightening was called suppression. Marco heard whispers become a unified cadence, as orderly as roll call. The more orderly it became, the more dangerous it grew. He opened the roll sheet. His thumb slid quickly down names, aligning the missing interval with the number of men who had entered the line in that segment. He compared stub numbers above and below the blank. His motions had to be small. The smaller they were, the more they looked like sneaking. The more they looked like sneaking, the more they would be misread. He still didn't speak. Speaking meant admitting he understood the rules. It meant standing with evidence rather than emotion. It meant losing neutrality in a group where neutrality was sometimes the only protection left. The stoppage stretched. The rear ranks' pressure hit the front ranks again and again. At the fence line, the weakest man's breathing made a thin, whistling sound. Marco treated the blank square like a crack and tried to patch it into a line of proof before the crack became flame. For the first time, he understood with clarity that the person who patched cracks was often pushed onto the crack first. The items on the sheet weren't only rations. Canteen coupons were keys inside the camp, a controlled medium for small purchases and supplementary supplies. On paper, each coupon had to correspond to a name, an issue, and a stub number. Before issuing, the sergeant counted coupon bundles, set them into a metal box, and locked the box in a drawer. The drawer opened only when the signature chain was complete. After the blank appeared, the drawer stayed shut. The lock hardware under the table made a faint metallic knock. It sounded like a reminder. Today's shares were caught in procedure. Only hours earlier, Marco had stood in a separate line at the registration board, waiting for roll call. New rosters and work assignments were posted. On a facilities sheet, 2 Italian service detachments had been added. The ink looked fresh, and beside it a red date stamp marked the entry. The lists broke up familiar groups and resorted them. Strong men were assigned to heavier hauling. Frail men were concentrated into cleaning and light work. Anyone hoping to trade positions through favors had to cross the paper rule first. In that moment, Marco had understood something the camp kept teaching in different forms. Paper was harder than fists, hard enough to press a man into a slot, hard enough to erase him from a slot. As the stoppage dragged on, someone in the line finally tried to break the rule with his body. From the rear, he surged forward, arm reaching toward the table, not toward the ledger on top, but toward the drawer below. An MP stepped into the corridor, drove a shoulder into the man's chest, shoved him back into the mass, then yanked him sideways and pinned him against the fence. The action did not swell into full chaos. It narrowed everyone's attention. The ledger and its blank square drew every gaze. The blank itself was like a silent order, pointing every impulse at the table and the drawer. In the minutes after sealing, the corridor became like a throat with something stuck in it. Every sound turned coarse and hard. The quartermaster sergeant did not look up. He laid the ledger, stubs, and roll sheet in sequence. His finger moved along line numbers and paused again and again between the 2 lines bordering the blank. Each pause felt like a second suspended above the line. The longer it hung, the faster the rear ranks breathed. The scuff of soles thickened into a steady rasp. The MPs extended the isolation zone slightly. The frail men were forced farther from the line's center, seated along the fence. Their eyes stayed on the issue window, as if refusing to look away could keep their names from falling off the paper. Marco's thumb kept flying down the roll sheet, aligning the head count for the time slot with the ledger line numbers. He had narrowed the blank to a tight interval, the minutes right after a shift change, when men returned from work detail, sweat and oil on them, the line briefly scattered and then reformed. In those minutes, the roll caller's voice ran faster. Stubs were passed forward more urgently. The signing hand had to pause on paper for a fraction of time. Any shove that broke that fraction was enough to lift a pen point off a line. The blank had not come from nowhere. It was like a displaced motion. Marco held that conclusion against his tongue and did not release it. He tried to keep hiding by aligning the gap privately, but his hiding was failing. Men stared at his page flipping as if it were privilege. Men linked him to the ceiling, saying he stood too close. He could see. He chose not to speak. The agitator's voice did not need to grow louder. It only needed to grow more certain. Certainty swallowed uncertainty whole. Stoppage, ceiling, isolation, people saw them as a single line. The line's end was theft. Marco stood beside the line. At last the quartermaster sergeant looked up. His gaze swept over Marco's shoulder and across the corridor like an assessment of how many minutes the line could bear. By regulation, he could continue sealing and wait for full review. By reality, every extra minute pushed the corridor closer to loss of control. The MP sergeant approached the table but did not touch the ledger. He stopped at the regulation distance, gaze moving from blank square to blank square again. His judgment carried no heat. It was the kind that was trained into muscle. Stop harm first, talk responsibility second. He ordered the line segmented, front ranks to step back half a pace, rear ranks to stop their feet. The command landed through boots and hand signals, as if tying knots into a rope about to snap. At the same time, he ordered the day's ledger and stubs sealed, along with the roll sheet, into the metal box. No one would touch the paper again. The ceiling drew a low growl from the corridor, as if locking evidence was the same as locking shares. The MP sergeant did something else first. He ordered the quartermaster section to prepare a make-up issuance mechanism. Make-up did not mean immediate issuing. It meant turning, if review confirms, it will be made good, into a public commitment meant to cap the urge to grab. The public commitment did not produce trust. It sharpened division. The agitator seized the word make-up and treated it as admission of theft. The weak men at the fence had no energy to nod. They pressed cracked lips into a thin line, as if even breathing spent what little they had left. Behind Marco, someone coughed deliberately. It wasn't illness. It was a reminder, a way of throwing attention onto his back. He knew he had been shoved into a position. He could stay silent to the end and let the system grind at its own speed. Or he could hand over the correspondence he had found while the system still allowed speech, giving review a direction rather than letting it float in rumor. He tried a third route. He tried to slip his line of numbers to the quartermaster sergeant, quietly, without letting the corridor hear. But in the MP and quartermaster rules, any lead had to be reviewable. Reviewable meant stating source, stating method, stating why he had access. What Marco offered was not a sentence. It was his capability and his position. The quartermaster sergeant looked at the line numbers and time slot Marco had written, made no comment, and clipped the slip into the folder. The motion was so steady, it looked like nothing had happened. To Marco, that steadiness was not protection. It placed him into a more dangerous blank. The corridor saw him lean in. It did not see what he handed over. It would treat leaning in as the answer. When the stoppage entered a second extended stretch, the corridor's consequences shifted from agitation to injury. In the isolation zone, the weakest prisoner suddenly sagged sideways. His shoulder struck the fence. His palm slapped the ground and failed to hold his weight. Fingertips dragged a short groove in the dust. An MP lifted him into shade. The mouth of a canteen came to his lips. The action was quick and controlled. Men in line saw water. They saw shade. They saw a body being carried. A brief hush passed through the corridor. Then another voice filled it. That should belong to everyone. Imagination about resources grew on the blank square faster than fact. Marco's stomach tightened. He understood the chain. If this continued, the weak would fall first. Falling would be read as proof of theft. The reading would ignite more impulses. Impulses would force harder MP tightening and punishment, and in the end the make-up mechanism itself might be lost. The tempo of procedure and the tempo of the group were decoupling. The crack was the blank square. He spread the roll sheet again, circled the names from the shift change interval, and wrote the stub numbers above and below the blank into a single sequence. The sequence broke in the middle. The break matched the blank. It matched the minutes when pushing had been at its heaviest. He did not need to know who had taken what. He needed to prove exactly which motion of handoff had been displaced. Proof meant testimony. Testimony meant public. Public meant choosing a side, and in prisoner groups, choosing a side often meant betrayal. The agitator finally aimed directly at him. Someone in the crowd deliberately bumped Marco's shoulder. The bump was not hard. It was hard enough to slide the paper in his hand half an inch. That half inch was magnified into panic. Nearby eyes snapped toward his hands as if he were hiding something. Marco steadied the sheet, fingers whitening. He understood he had no route left. Silence was no longer neutral. Silence only left the blank to the most certain rumor. The MP sergeant returned to the table and ordered the translator to repeat the rule in short lines. Submit reviewable gap points. There would be no judgment by emotion. The clearer the rule became, the cruder the agitator's story looked. Yet in hunger, crudity could still be stronger. Marco listened to the repeated rule and felt another pressure drop. Cold, heavy. If he spoke, he would have to speak within the threshold of reviewability. He could not offer a conclusion. He could offer only a chain. He lifted his head and for the first time took his eyes off paper and onto the corridor. He saw the man by the fence still breathing in the shade. He saw hands in the front rank locked onto the wood rail as if gripping it kept the line from moving. He saw toes in the rear still probing forward unconsciously. Every motion waited for a signal. Marco knew that if the blank happened again, or if stoppage stretched again, the signal would turn into a charge. When the stoppage reached the half-hour mark, heat lay over throats like a wet cloth. The MPs fixed the segmented line completely. The front segment was forced back behind a chalk mark. The rear segment was held at the corner by the fence. Any forward probe met a boot's lateral block. The quartermaster sergeant set the metal box in the center of the table, lock facing up. Inside were the day's ledger, stubs, and roll sheet. The lock's click sounded unusually loud in the crush. The MP sergeant ordered the translator and the clerk into place at the table. First, the clerk wrote into a brief record that today's stoppage was solely connected to a record gap. Next, the clerk wrote and posted a public notice. If review confirmed, make-up would be immediate. When the paper was nailed to the temporary board, a low growl still ran through the corridor, but it lacked the earlier sharpness of men about to claw their way forward. The agitator was isolated on the far side and kept sending anger back into the line with hand signs and eyes. The transmission needed no language. The simpler it was, the more force it carried. The MP sergeant did not try to crush all motion. He divided it. He kept the weak men in shade and moved water and a simple salt mixture to them through procedure. He ordered the strong to hold their places and forbade leaving the line. He had the quartermaster section recount reserve bundles but kept the drawer closed, giving no one a tangible target to snatch. Order was not built by shouting. It was built by blocking the paths where impulse could become action. Marco stood at the registration table holding the sequence he had written. Line numbers, the shift change interval, the stub break. The paper edges had softened with sweat. He understood the threshold had been raised and fixed. To enter procedure, he had to submit reviewable gap points. To submit them meant explaining how he had obtained them. The explanation would push him into the center of both the MP gaze and the prisoner's gaze. Silence could no longer buy safety. Silence was being read as participation. The MP sergeant's eyes settled on him. There was no threat in them. There was only the hard demand that facts carry weight. The sergeant indicated that Marco should place his paper on the table. The translator turned the gesture into procedure. The count and entry man would submit the gap correspondence as the first lead for review. Marco spread the sheet. Line numbers, times, and stub sequence formed a broken chain in open sight. The break aligned with the ledger's blank. The missing stub number aligned with the shift change interval. The interval aligned with the moment the line had scattered and reformed. The reformation aligned with the minutes when shoves had knocked signing hands off paper. Marco aligned the roll sheet head count to the ledger line numbers and made the essential point. The gap did not fall on any one man's name. It fell in the seam of handoff, in the instant when signature and stub transfer had been displaced. In the rear of war, the most dangerous thing was not losing a portion of food, but a blank square on a ledger that made violence feel more real than rules. The sentence landed without volume. It did not need volume. Marco had set the blank's meaning into procedure. The blank shifted from imagined theft to broken handoff. The MP sergeant immediately broke the broken handoff into traceable nodes. He ordered the quartermaster section to provide on-duty records for the men responsible for taking stubs and collecting signatures before and after the shift change. He ordered the roll caller to provide the roll tempo and the instruction that had scattered and reformed the line. He ordered the MP positions that had held the corridor in those minutes recorded as well. The inquiry no longer revolved around who stole. It revolved around which handoff had been interrupted, who had been present, and who carried responsibility for restoring the record. The corridor went quiet for a short stretch, not because trust had bloomed, because a path had been drawn that did not require fists to reach makeup. The quiet did not cushion Marco. It sharpened judgment. Someone in the line edged half a step forward, finger pointing at Marco's paper, and then at Marco's chest. The face carried practiced certainty, certainty that needed no proof. Other eyes followed. More eyes gathered. The accusation stopped orbiting the blank. It orbited Marco's knowledge, why he understood this, why he could speak the chain so clearly. Someone dragged his past into the center. The old breach, the act of shifting rations during an Italian warehouse confusion, was made into an identity. The logic was simple and brutal. If he had breached once, he must be breaching now. They tried to bind knowing the ledger to taking from the ledger and to pull procedure back down into the group's anger. Marco's throat tightened. He knew there was no escape. Denial would look like evasiveness. Silence would look like admission. The only way to keep procedure alive was to hand himself over to it. He acknowledged the past act. During chaos, he had moved a small amount of ration stock to purchase a favor that kept him alive. Not a robbery, still a breach. He had lived for a long time with the shame of it, and he acknowledged why that shame mattered here. Because he knew how grey gaps crushed the weak first. Because he knew how, once records broke, every share became prey. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not dress himself as righteous. He placed the past fact beside the present fact, so the same grey seam could be seen, how it destroyed order. The consequences arrived immediately. Some men stepped back half a pace, as if evading contamination. Some men clenched fists and then loosened them. The restraint did not come from kindness. It came because the MP tightening had left no channel for impulse to travel. The MP sergeant entered Marco's admission into the record, not to humiliate him, but to make the source of the lead traceable so that makeup and discipline could stand on the same evidentiary chain. The quartermaster sergeant locked the metal box again and hung the key at his belt with the steadiness of a machine resetting. He announced that issuing would remain paused. Review and makeup registration would proceed first. The weak would receive water, salt mixture, and simple sustenance as priority. Everyone else would wait in segmented order. There was no rush of bodies into the table. The crisis was capped. Marco lost his last cover anyway. He stepped back from the registration table half a pace. The gaze behind him was no longer only hunger. It was cold, labeled. He could hear the fence line man's breathing smoother. He could see a hand in the shade withdraw from the dirt. He could feel his place in the group being remarked. He was no longer an invisible mover of numbers. He was the man who pushed the blank back into the rules, and the man who would bear what the blank had almost ignited. The MP sergeant ordered 2 MPs to take Marco to a side room at the corridor's far end, keeping him from standing in the center of the line as a new spark. The air inside was cooler. A simple process chart hung on the wall, paper edges curled, tacked down in a way that looked like it was meant to resist being torn by emotion. The clerk wrote time. The shift change interval was circled. On-duty lists, position records, roll tempo, each was listed as a pending check item. Marco sat on a bench. His palms were still wet. Dust filled his nail beds. He understood he had not handed over a scrap of paper. He had handed over a chain that would force responsibility back to a particular post, a particular handoff node. Outside, the corridor's growl rose and fell like surf against fencing. The MPs, by regulation, issued water and simple sustenance first to the isolation zone. The issuing was public and slow, so every man could see the replenishment happen. Seeing was not the same as believing, but it stole impulse of its excuse. Through the half-closed door, Marco heard soles scraping and short coughs. He heard his name repeated. not as a call for help, but as warning. He closed his eyes. The smell of sweat and metal dust still sat in his nose. For the first time, the price of survival shifted away from hunger and into something colder. When the side room door shut again later, the corridor's noise pressed against the walls like breath held too long. The metal box still sat at the corner of the table, tagged with date and seal time. The tape that held the tag looked like a second lock. The MP sergeant cleared the tabletop into a straight line, and the translator and clerk took their places at the regulation distance, pen points falling first on time and then on line numbers and stub sequences, as if forcing the corridor's chaos into boxes could keep it from spilling. The review moved through the same sequence, now with the added steadiness of a chain tightening rather than unraveling. The blank ledger line was centered. The stubs above and below were matched. The gap was verified. The roll sheet for the shift change interval was matched, names cramped, ink doubled. The MP corridor position notes were matched. Each element supported the same conclusion, and because it supported, it also pointed. Procedure moved first to stop bleeding. The MP sergeant marked the makeup range and ordered it registered as a list bounded by ledger line numbers and time slot. The quartermaster section recounted coupon bundles by bundle number, recorded box and bundle identifiers, recorded each handoff time, recorded witnesses present. The goal was not to make the crowd feel good. The goal was to make the record chain real enough that feeling could not replace it. When the corridor opened again, the MPs brought the weakest men forward first, keeping them on the edge of shade. Water and salt mixture were issued by procedure. Only then were make-up coupons and corresponding issue items brought out. Every stub handed in, every signature made, was slowed just enough to be seen. The ledger's signature squares filled one by one. Witness initials appeared beside them. Stub numbers returned to continuity. In the rear segment, shoulders still nudged. The nudges no longer had a target. The drawer stayed locked unless the chain closed and the table stayed guarded. The agitator was taken aside for questioning. Each statement was required to land on time and place. Anything that couldn't be anchored was left outside the record. Discipline would not be dramatic, it would be procedural, built on contradictions between speech and written line. The quartermaster section then posted the new issuance principles on the bulletin board and repeated them aloud through translation in stripped-down clauses. Two-person verification as routine. Signatures at the moment of issue. No shift change during issuing. Better to delay issuance than break handoff. The rules were rough in their repetition. They were also the only thing in the corridor that did not change shape with fear. Marco was returned to his registration duty, but his motions were now formally bounded. Any reach across the table required a witness. Any transfer of paper required eyes on it. The limitation protected him and also marked him. He could no longer pretend that closeness to paper meant invisibility. Every mark he made would be watched. When makeup finished, he stepped away from the table and walked back toward the sleeping area. Low voices followed him like dust. Faces turned aside as he passed. At the water barrel, someone paused until he filled his canteen first, keeping distance so clean it felt like a line drawn in air. Night roll call brought colder river wind. Light threw ragged shadows on fencing. Marco stood mid-line and heard his name called. He stepped forward, stopped in the assigned spot, and waited while the registrar's pencil made a small stroke beside his name. His fingers, by habit, searched for something to trade for safety. They found only the seam thread of his trousers. He stood still. Later, at issuing time, he followed the new rhythm. Present stub, wait for the signature, see the witness initial. Step back. The actions were plain, and in their plainness they began to pry him away from the older instinct of living by seams. In the morning he stopped before the bulletin board. The make-up notice had been overwritten by fresh signatures and witness marks. The ledger line numbers that had bordered the blank were struck through and annotated with initials and a date stamp. The ink had dried into a hard certainty. In the line, the weakest man stood a little straighter. He still looked exhausted, but his eyes were no longer hollow. They moved from the board's lines to the table at the issue window and back again, as if confirming that something could exist in the corridor that shoving could not push away. Marco looked at those eyes and did not look away. Beyond the fence, the arsenal's machines never stopped. The power hammer's vibration ran underfoot. The sound kept reminding him that the war was still a system that turned people into numbers and then sent the numbers outward, into losses and repairs far away. In that sound, Marco remembered the feel of shifting rations years earlier. It had not been the weight of food. It had been the weight of dependence, folded into an exchangeable unit. He had set that shame down inside procedure now, and what it bought was not forgiveness. It bought an evidentiary line, ink and initials, that kept the man at the fence from being pushed out of the record and therefore pushed out of the ration line. On the third day, issuance was deliberately delayed by half an hour. Shift change happened first. Chalk marks were refreshed. MPs fixed positions at every turn. At the table, 2 pens were laid out, and a second quartermaster stood as witness. Head count was verified, bundle seals checked, and only then was the drawer unlocked. Every stub transfer happened under 2 sets of eyes. After each signature, the witness pressed a fingertip briefly near the ink to confirm the square had been filled. No shove could lift the pen off the paper now, without being seen and recorded. The line stayed long. Hunger stayed sharp. The corridor was forced to spend itself at a slower pace, like a herd compelled to learn waiting. Watching the new motions from the table's edge, Marco felt a clarity that was almost cruel. Rules did not make men kinder. They stripped away the excuses that allowed kindness and cruelty to hide. They forced actions to leave traces. Men still cut him with their eyes. Men still treated him as an untrustworthy edge piece. But when the ledger was clipped in full view, when the box seal was replaced, when the date stamp landed on paper, he saw something small change in those eyes. A pause, like the blink between judgments, a moment that admitted paper could reach an outcome faster than fists could. Night again brought machine noise that never stopped. The record chains made in this corridor would leave this place too, filed, shipped, absorbed into the vast rear that fed the front. The prisoners would remain here, building tomorrow out of roll call, issuance, review, makeup, and waiting. Under the lamp, the weakest man opened his hand. The knuckles still showed abrasions, but he could close the cap on his canteen by himself. His gaze no longer tracked anyone's back in search of a protector or a target. It stayed on the bulletin board's lines, as if staring long enough could make a path real and repeatable. Marco watched that gaze and understood something that had not been clear when the corridor first jammed. He had not changed the war. He had not changed alignments. He had done something narrower and harder. On a wooden table in the rear, he had pulled one person from the edge where bodies and blanks could push him, and returned him to the center of the record. Marco would keep carrying shame. Suspicion would keep circling him. In line, his name would sometimes be mouthed as if chewed and broken. None of that disappeared because a ledger square filled. But when he lifted his eyes now, his gaze could pass over the fence and down the corridor and land on the orderly stack of stubs clipped into sequence, on signature squares filled, on the weak man standing steadier in line. For the first time, he pulled survival out of calculation and placed it inside a chain that could be reviewed. That chain was thin, only ink, a date stamp, witness initials. Yet it was thick enough to make eyes stop at the edge of blank space and hesitate. It was thick enough to keep a crowd from turning at once toward violence as the quickest proof, and instead turn just long enough toward the next breath that could be verified.